end of quote. I argue that this contrast generates a colonial dialectic of place and time in this film. Though apparently unchanged over time, the life of the Mennonites, like that of all Protestants, is characterized by secularization, the gradual transformation of eternity into profane chronological time. What Reygadas calls timelessness here is in fact a temporalization of faith that he interrupts with epiphanic time images, showcasing, as Cynthia Tompkins argued, the categories of time that Deleuze has identified in film, namely the crystal image, peaks of present, and sheets of the past, end of quote. Similarly, the supposed non-place of Chihuahua is not merely occupied territory by white settlers, but also the place where nature is turned into a promised land. Protestant interiority, as depicted in Dreyer's Audit, expands here over the colonized land as a manifest destiny. To the degree that secular and sacred time are related in this film, so are colonial land and divine nature. Both dimensions coincide in the opening of the immanent frame, which, as a theological concept, describes the aesthetics of silence in Stellet Licht as well as its colonial foundations. Despite being a love story, it is the landscape of Chihuahua that is the main character in the film, which begins with a panning shot across the night sky that continues as an extended tracking shot over the rising sun over the prairie. The starry heavens above and the moral law within, perhaps too Kantian for the Mennonites, but Reygadas' opening shot certainly resonates with the aesthetics of awe in the face of inward and outward infinity that Kant speaks of in his second critique. In fact, this shot suggests a congruence of both dimensions as the sun slowly rises and illuminates the earth, while the chirping of the crickets fades and the moaning of the kettle becomes audible. Starry heavens above make way for the fertile soil below, which is what existentially grounds the world of the Mennonites. The disinterested spectator of this landscape at dawn may wonder at the countless multitudes of worlds, but only one of such worlds becomes visible in the first shot as Mennonite farmland, as we hear the cows greeting the day. We see their milk in the cereal bowls of the family that owns this land, as Johann and his wife Esther sit with their 7 children around the kitchen table, silently praying. They are still, but the camera introduces them as animated by the shot of their reflection in the pendulum of a clock. The measured secular time contrasts with the cyclical cosmic time that is suggested in the opening long take. As the pendulum chops away the seconds, it reflects the family reaffirming their faith and the moral convictions that brought them to this land. The clock on the wall secularizes the cosmic time into a structure that organizes the pious lifestyle of Johann's and Esther's family, whereas the opening shot materializes transcendent nature as landscape and farmland. This scene secularizes religious beliefs into a life determined by labor and family. Johann is looking quietly at his silently praying wife, almost skeptically observing the morning grace rather than leading it. Using one of the few Latin words we hear in this movie, the patriarch concludes the prayer with Amen. Then we hear the children speak in Plautdeutsch, the Low German dialect that the Mennonites preserved through centuries of migration. Stellet Licht is the only feature film in this language, and its mostly Mexican cast is joined by native speakers from Canada and Germany. Amen. So be it. Or is this it? Not only does Johann's face express doubt, he has, as we later learn, already violated the code of the sacred family by having an affair with a waitress named Marianne. His wife Esther knows. He told her, and both are well aware that this goes against everything they and their community live for. After Esther and the kids take off, Johann sits alone, then steps onto a chair and stops the pendulum of the clock that reminded him of the secular rhythm of his life as a family man, farmer, and devout Christian. Beyond the charge of adultery, this moral conflict is as old as fiction and marks the universal appeal of Reygadas' story. However, the preservation of the Mennonite lifestyle is the very basis for their migration, as well as their colonial claim to the land. If this erodes from within, then there is nowhere else to go. In this scene, the moral law that rigidly prescribes the Mennonite lifestyle is tied to the land that the settlers occupy. In other words, the transcendental being that prescribes these laws is their reason to be, their literal and figurative Daseinsgrund. As if to reassure himself of his existential state, Johann puts on his cowboy hat and drives his pickup truck along the fields like he owns them. He visits his friend Zacharias, and the two have a conversation about his relationship status. Waving cornfields and cloud-dotted blue skies in the back, Johann and Zacharias lean against their pickup trucks, their faces shaded by their cowboy hats. They discuss the powerful thing that has come over Johann and whether it would be best to suffer in silence or to challenge destiny, which, as the images suggest, is not only Johann's personal destiny, but moreover implies the manifest destiny of the Mennonites. Johann feels that his natural woman Johann feels that Marianne is his natural woman, and Zacharias replies that his feeling may be founded on something sacred, even if we don't understand it. These two competing concepts of the sacred constitute Johann's tragic conflict, but also offer him a way out of it. For if his feelings for Marianne are sacred love, an intervention of fate to correct an error that he made by choosing Esther as his wife, then he is not doomed. For Johann, the Mennonite farmer, this means that adultery and divorce would not necessarily dispel him from the divine kingdom of Mennonite Chihuahua. Convinced by his friend to follow his instinct, he sings along to a country song playing on the radio, No Volveré. In the language of the non-Mennonites, he sings about leaving his wife for good, starts his truck and encircles the camera several times before driving off, in what looks reminiscent of a Werner Herzog signature shot of circular futility. The moral conflict between sacred desire and religious law is momentarily resolved as we see Johann stride through tall grass towards a romantic overlook where Marianne is waiting. As if energized by the telluric powers of the land, we see the feet of the two lovers for an extended moment before their faces appear in front of a sun-drenched landscape panorama. Smiling hesitantly at first, they kiss for minutes in a close-up shot against the sun, producing an intense lens flare that looks like a calda mobile revolving around them. The landscape, the earth, the sky, and the light are as much part of this intimacy as the two entangled bodies. There is a sense that material and spiritual nature become indistinguishable as they merge in the kiss of the two lovers and the elements surrounding them. According to Lutz Köpnick, the long take is a medium to reconstruct spaces for the possibility of wonder. The temporal stretching Reygadas' long take accomplishes in this scene also transforms the secular landscape of colonization into a sacred space, a placeless utopia we marvel at. According to Deleuze, the crystal image reveals the nature of time and crystallizes not only the possible pasts and futures by extended duration, but depicts the very foundations of time. The chronos of the clock that Johann stopped earlier represents his secularized beliefs, while the sacred love to Marianne suspends chronological time and establishes a fundamentally different temporality, which Deleuze associates with chronos or aion. Beyond mere duration, Reygadas amplifies this crystallization of time by the excessive lens flare that creates a colorful sphere of circles around the couple. While the entire film employs wide angles, it is especially in these extended close-up scenes that the space seems to bend just as time does. Within this crystal image, we see not only two temporal orders collapsing, but also the spiritual order of the orders of the transcendent and the immanent. Instead of showing the spiritual as something above nature or as being identical with it, Reygadas presents us with an immanent frame that is opening and thus allows for the spiritual to become present. While Deleuze's concept of the movement image is determined by the dynamic between what is within the frame and what is outside of it, in the time image, each frame has its own temporality. Depth of focus and static camera are typical features of the time image that Deleuze historicized for the post-war era. And the kissing scene between Marianne and Johann is in this sense a typical time image. It establishes a spiritual reality that differs from the secularized Mennonite lifestyle and allows for the wanderers to enter the frame. For Charles Taylor, the immanent frame means to see the world as an entirely self-sufficient, without reference to a higher spiritual order, similar to Max Weber's Iron Cage. For Taylor, this view is characteristic of the modern secular age and is not necessarily atheist. Instead, it transfers what is transcendent into an immanent frame, for example, by experiencing the divine in nature or feeling a sense of belonging to a native land. For the Mennonites, this means the transferal of religious belief into labor, of the heavenly kingdom into an earthly kingdom, of the spiritual sphere into a sphere of custom and dogma. Through the preservation of this secularized content and their migration history, this also means colonization. In fact, it is imperative to establish this immanence by means of occupying and cultivating land. Symbolically, this was the process of secularization that Johann halted when he stopped the clock. After seeking approval from Zacharias that his love is not a sin, but a divine intervention, we see him and Marianne in that immanent frame as it opens. The divine love that violates the Mennonite doctrine enters the picture. For Taylor, this would be an opening of the immanent frame, I quote, a kind of punctual hole blown in the regular order of things from outside, that is, from the transcendent, end of quote. In other words, a miracle. It is here that the theological concept of the immanent frame overlaps with Deleuze's time image. The duration, the varying depth of focus, and the lens effects invoke the entry of transcendence into the picture, which turns the carnal love between Johann and Marianne into a spiritual one, and the colonized land around them into divine immanent nature. The film offers these openings of the immanent frame in abundance and is, instead of a plot-driven love story, a succession of such wondrous moments. The sense of the wonder culminates in the miraculous scene that directly references Dreyer's audit. When Marianne kisses the deceased Esther in her open coffin and reawakens her. So here we see Esther in her coffin, and here below we see the shot in Dreyer's audit with Inga. Just like Johannes tells Inga to rise from the dead in audit, it is an act of faith that affirms secular life. The corresponding symbol of the clock in Dreyer's film is stopped right after Inga's death and is restarted after she awakens and utters the film's final word, life. Reygadas' adaptation of this symbol works a bit differently. As we have seen, Johann stops the clock in the beginning of the film and before he meets with Marianne. At Esther's funeral, he tells Marianne that he wants to turn back time, to which she replies that this is the only thing that we can do. As Esther is reawakened from the dead by Marianne, the mourning family sits next door, where Johann's father restarts the clock that his son had stopped earlier. The religious miracle and the aesthetics of wonder coincide at the moment where the immanent frame closes and secular time restarts. Johann can be at peace now, says Marianne to Esther in her coffin, before leaving the scene and thereby re-establishing the secular nuclear family. As Johann enters the room, a butterfly exits the room, which we follow out to the open fields where the sun begins to set and Reygadas repeats the opening long take in reverse. We are left with a sense of wonder at the miracle that just happened, staring at the sunset over the old Mennonite colony, as if it was a spiritual landscape, a timeless, placeless reality. As I showed, the effects of awe and wonder that Reygadas generates are founded on a dialectic of religious temporality, the employment of cinematic styles such as the crystal image and the long take, but most importantly, on the staging of this religious love triangle against the background of a chapter of German colonial history. This specific historic content contrasts the contemplation of faith in Dreyer's cinema of transcendence and inwardness with a framework of immanence and colonial expansion. Thank you. Ljudmila, you're muted.
Thank you so much. Let me restart. I'm sorry about that. Thank you, André, for that wonderful presentation. Next, we will hear from Elizabeth Biz Nijdam. Elizabeth Biz is assistant professor in German studies in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. She's also an SSHRC postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo, working on her book manuscript Panel Pasts, History, Media, and Memory in the German Graphic Novel, which is under contract with Ohio State University Press. Congratulations. Biz's research interests include the representation of history in comics, comics and new media on migration, and comics as a feminist methodology, which is the subject of her next book project. Biz sits on the executive committee of the International Comic Arts Forum and the executive board for the Comics Studies Society. Her paper is titled Mobilizing Migration Technologies in Refugee Cinema, the Smartphone Aesthetics of Hassan Fazili's Midnight Traveler. Take it away.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers for putting this on. I really look forward to the feedback I'll get because this is a very new project for me. So without further ado, I shall share my screen. The prologue to Hassan Fazili's 2019 documentary film, Midnight Traveler, opens with a shot of the carrying case of the Fazili's family's digital camera. Resting on the carpet in the left-hand side of the frame, the branding of the Sony digital camera is immediately legible but feels out of place. Furthermore, as the woman behind the camera, the director's wife, Fatima Hosseini, starts speaking in Afghan Persian, the English language camera case and its contents is rendered even more significant by the way in which it doesn't map on to the kind of objects typically found in living rooms of this geographic region. The scene cuts to footage of a young Fazili before we are introduced to the couple's eldest daughter, Nargis, in front of whom we see Fatima behind the camera itself through her reflection in the window. The viewer continues to watch footage of the Fazili children, Nargis and Zara, growing up through the lens of the family Sony digital camera, dancing, visiting the zoo and amusement parks, laughing and playing. We thereby come to know this particular family through the digital device we first encounter in the opening scene of Fazili's documentary. However, very soon into this introduction, the footage of Fazili's digital camera stops and we're introduced to a different kind of device on which the remaining hour and 24 minutes of the documentary will be filmed. After a series of shots featuring a voiceover by Nargis, in which she contemplates the location of hell, the montage abruptly cuts to an intertitle, which reads, "This film was shot entirely on 3 mobile phones." Paralleling the opening image privileging the digital camera, this moment at the conclusion of the documentary's prologue focuses on the smartphone technology that facilitated the making of this film. The smartphone device is thereby immediately elevated to the role of the director's camera as we join the family as they flee the Taliban on their journey from Afghanistan to Hungary before settling in Germany after the conclusion of the documentary film in 2018, where they now have permanent residency. But what is interesting about this intertitle indicating the technology upon which the documentary film was captured is not just that the viewer now has a sense of the physicality of filming this particular documentary film, nor is it that the kind of footage the viewer is about to encounter maintains important connections with the kind stored on their own smartphone media archive. It's that with smartphones making frequent and regular appearances throughout this documentary film as recording devices, as well as in a myriad of other functions, this intertitle reveals how Fazili's film is as much about the family's migrant journey as it is about the mobile device used to document that experience. Films about filming and self-reflexive documentary that specifically thematize the camera lens are not all that unusual. After all, Dziga Vertov's experimental yet now canonical film from 1929, Man with a Movie Camera, opens with a shot of the camera to similarly gesture towards the role of this 6-reel recording device in the document of Soviet urban life. Furthermore, directors from Michael Moore to Werner Herzog worked to disrupt the illusion of the camera's objectivity through complex notions of authorship and the role of autobiography in film. However, Fazili's Midnight Traveler is doing so much more than simply thematizing the camera's lens to draw attention to the constructed nature of the cinematic medium. In particular, as I argue in this presentation, it is also highlighting the essential nature of smartphone technologies in the lives of refugees, as well as the role of mediation in the representation of experience of forced migration more generally. Through the smartphone lens, Fazili's Midnight Traveler thereby becomes as much a document of witness of the Fazili family's journey to the EU as a rumination on the media representation of refugee experience itself. The incorporation of smartphone devices into documentary film on forced migration might read as a consequence of the contemporary nature of these texts. Yet the appearance of smartphones in documentary film is not as common as you might think. For example, the first feature-length film to feature smartphone footage, the Academy Award-winning documentary Searching for Sugar Man, was released in 2012 and was only partially filmed on an iPhone. More recently, however, even feature-length narrative films such as Sean Baker's 2015 Tangerine are being exclusively shot on smartphones. Yet despite smartphone successes, the majority of feature documentaries are still shot on expensive professional cameras. But what I find remarkable about the decision to shoot on a smartphone camera is that the deliberate choice connects meaningfully to the content of the film. Steven Soderbergh's 2018 psychological horror film, Unsane, for example, thematizes the construction of reality that is invested in digital and new media, while Tristan Pope's 2014 rom-com short, Romance in NYC, uses the iPhone upon which it was filmed to reflect the intimacy of the couple portrayed as they gallivant through the Big Apple, with the director commenting that, quote, "The natural view of the iPhone mimics our real-life romantic point of view." Recently, documentary film on forced migration in conflict zones has also begun to take advantage of smartphones in documenting the experiences of refugees and displaced people. This has emerged largely as a consequence of their versatility, such as in the documentary film Syria Songs of Defiance, for which the anonymous Al Jazeera journalist was able to risk carrying a camera around as he sought to capture the compelling footage of the Syrian civil war. Furthermore, other documentaries, such as Silvered Water, Syria, Self-Portrait, the BBC series Exodus, Our Journey to Europe, and Ai Weiwei's epic documentary Human Flow similarly employ found and filmed footage from camera phones to reveal experiences of people and places impossible for traditional camera work to access and record. With the continued thematization of the smartphone in the media of migration, which is the larger theme under which this particular research I'm presenting today falls, it is clear that there is value for authors and artists, many of them refugees themselves, in recounting their experience through this essential technology. However, with Midnight Traveler, the mobilization of the smartphone device is pushed beyond its status as a tool for the film cinematography, with Fazili explicitly revealing the importance of mobile devices in the lives of migrants and refugees, as well as in terms of the media representation of forced migration. In fact, Midnight Traveler's mobilization of smartphone technology as a tool, a theme, and a prop illuminates how mobile devices have begun to shape the way migrants and refugees experience the migrant journey, as much as how smartphone technology is impacting the way they narrativize these experiences. According to a 2016 study, smartphones and the way they facilitate social media networks in particular provide lifelines for refugees on their journeys to Europe. 84% of the population in the Middle East and North Africa make use of a smartphone, and 84% of Syrian refugee households in Lebanon, for example, rely on WhatsApp to communicate with friends, family, volunteers. Users send messages, voice recordings, and video recordings around the globe in seconds, informing their loved ones of their current location and well-being, while also receiving the important support, hope, and encouragement they require to continue their journeys. Furthermore, smartphones and social media are essential in crowdsourcing information en route. Migrants share maps, contacts, and advice in both public and private groups, with Facebook in particular used to crowdsource information. While refugees often connect to Facebook to communicate with family and friends, they also use it as a forum to contact influential figures in their social media networks, from prominent and respected activists and NGOs to investigative journalists, political commentators, public intellectuals, and participants in controversial debates. Moreover, with access to reliable news and trusted information a perpetual struggle, migrants often turn to news shared by respected friends and family through social media for information. Younger generations specifically consider information relayed through social media trustworthier than news distributed through traditional news media sources. And when mobile phones are lost or damaged, Facebook accounts enable a permanent, if intermittent, perpetual presence. The portability of smartphones in particular sets these devices apart from previous communication tools and has resulted in a new kind of migration experience premised on perpetual connectivity. While many of us experience this kind of constant communication in our daily lives, for refugees, it takes on new dimensions. Access to information via social media can make the difference between life and death for not only individuals and families, but entire boats full of people. With refugees arriving on European soil with only a smartphone, anxious to find a place to recharge it, these mobile devices have become foundational in shaping the movements of migrants, helping them navigate unfamiliar territory through wayfinding apps, and creating a kind of digital passage to the EU. For refugees seeking to reach Europe, the digital infrastructure of social media, news and refugee-oriented apps, and Google Maps is therefore just as important as the physical infrastructure of roads, railways, sea crossings, and the borders controlling the free movement of people. However, the ubiquity and necessity of smartphones in the migrant journey has also resulted in these devices' negative portrayal in the media coverage of migrants and refugees, never mind the issues of surveillance that they present. Daniel McLaughlin's 2015 article in the Irish Times, for example, draws attention to the shifting iconography of smartphones and representations of forced migration. Referring to refugees as, quote, smartphone-wielding migrants, end quote, this article reveals the ambivalence of media coverage on the role of mobile devices in migrant experience, in which a smartphone can either rescue a refugee or make them a terrorist. After the Paris attacks in particular, the smartphone became a, quote, terrorist essential instead of a refugee essential in many reports. Yet Fazili's documentary does so much more than reflect the importance of this device in pursuing the migration journey. It also reveals how smartphone technology is changing how we narrate and narrativize migrant experience in the post-migrant condition. Furthermore, as a cinematic technology, the consequences of this particular device in documentary film draw from discourses that span photography to film studies. For example, as a kind of meta-cinema, Midnight Traveler is a self-reflexive documentary, essentially a film about filmmaking. It therefore constantly acknowledges the primary tool of its own creation, and thus reveals the cinematic artifice of documentary filmmaking in general, while undermining the illusion of machine objectivity in the capturing of documentary footage. Midnight Traveler thereby opens up discourses on the technical, cultural, political, and organizational processes of film production. Moreover, in light of the viewer's own relationship with mobile devices, the way Fazili's film simultaneously thematizes smartphone technology, the smartphone technology with which the film footage is captured, changes the viewer's relationship to that which is presented to them, defining the cinematic experience as immediate, intimate, private, and personal through the lens of the camera phone. In addition to the kind of embodiment implied by the handheld nature of the mobile device, the visible transitions of switching back and forth between camera phones and Midnight Traveler presents the devices on which these moments are being recorded as they are recording. And this is the example that I have here. It's 4 shots that take place one after another, in which you see the family members recording each other, recording their scenery. This kind of cinematography thus thematizes the very representation of the experience presented, not by obfuscating mediation in the way photojournalism does, and instead revealing the camera, filming the camera's intervention, and articulating the camera's presence. Furthermore, with smartphone technology's role in making the mundane interesting and the everyday the subject of cinematic inquiry, this perspective provides a new lens for viewing the world through a new kind of camera vision, one immediately familiar to every audience member. And according to Gabby David, these person-machine interactions form the very foundation of mobile documentary's power to transform important cultural notions, especially with regard to the boundaries between the individual and the collective, the private and the public, and memory and experience. With the Fazili family, both subject and object, author and content, director and actors, Midnight Traveler and other first-person films collapse distinctions between subjectivity and objectivity, as well as between past and present. The mobile filmmaker thus creates a mediated experience of remembering through the smartphone lens that unsettles temporal conventions of culturally important human experiences. Mobile film's perceived intimacy and first-person perspective emphasizes the present tense to intervene in discourses, and explicitly literary discourses, on forced migration, which all too often present human experience as if even contemporary events exist in the past. Ultimately, Fazili's decision to use smartphone technology in the telling of his family's migrant journey has profound aesthetic and theoretical consequences on the content and experience of the film. However, the aspect of the film's smartphone aesthetics I want to conclude with today is how, by thematizing its own production through the camera phone lens and ruminating on the artistic conventions of its making, Midnight Traveler becomes critical of its modes of representation and the genre expectations of representing refugee experience more broadly, transforming into a commentary on the mediation of forced migration at the conclusion of the documentary film. In the last 15 minutes of Midnight Traveler, while the Fazilis await their paperwork to travel to Hungary, Zara, the family's youngest daughter, goes inexplicably missing for an afternoon. The filmmaker's attention immediately shifts to searching for his daughter, but as the viewer quickly notes, the footage of the search is palpably missing from the documentary. This segment of the film, which had opened with "I am a happy filmmaker, I love cinema," rapidly transitions to a commentary on how, quote unquote, dirty filmmaking can feel. In the voiceover to follow, Fazili performs a monologue that spans the duration of the documentary's attention to Zara's search, in which Fazili recounts his own impulse to take advantage of the dramatic moment of Zara's frightening disappearance. He thinks, "What a scene you're in. You're searching through the bushes. You're searching in the bushes. This will be the best scene in the film. Maybe you should turn on your camera and look for Zara with your camera on." At this point, the screen has gone dark. The moon, which had been our focal point during the scene in Fazili's film, has disappeared. You can hear his voice cracking, as even recounting this moment becomes very emotional for the director. Fazili continues, "It just popped into my head. I didn't focus on it. For one moment, for a second, I imagined Zara's body, and from the distance, Fatima is running. I have my camera in hand. I'm filming that moment," end quote. He concludes by saying that he only imagined the scene for for a second as it flashed through his mind, but in that brief moment, he continues, he hated himself so much. Furthermore, he hated cinema. In this instant, the viewer has access to the other side of these horrific moments, all too often captured by photojournalists and circulated through the news media. The moments during which the vulnerable bodies of migrants and refugees are put on display to compel viewers into action as part of human rights campaigns or to generate attention for news media franchises. However, with the director's refusal to document this particular moment, Fazili's use of the camera phone's perspective, or here lack thereof, he uses the camera phone's perspective, or lack thereof, to intervene in the conventions of this kind of representation. Midnight Traveler thereby introduces new ways of seeing and viewing the content and themes of forced migration that focuses on the humanity instead of the mortality of families such as his, through the almost universal familiarity of the smartphone lens and the role of mobile devices in all of our lives. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Biz, for that engaging presentation. Next, we will hear from Kumars Salehi. Kumars is a PhD candidate in German literature and culture at the University of California in Berkeley, and he's specializing in philosophy and critical theory. He also serves as managing researcher for the Multicultural Germany Project, an initiative of the USC Berkeley Department of German. The project aims to foster interdisciplinary research addressing the changing cultural identities and political fault lines of the German-speaking world in the era of global capitalism, mass migration, and nationalist reaction. His dissertation, titled The Dialectical Curmudgeon, Afterlives of Hegel in German Literature and Political Thought, traces the ambivalent legacy of dialectical theory in the German intellectual tradition. His paper today is called Not Another Exilic Movie, Alienation and the Everyday in Sohrab, Shahid, Salesses, Reifezeit, and Tagebuch eines Liebenden.
Hello, everybody. Sorry to jump in there. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everybody. That may be a dated reference in the title. I'm not going to waste time pointing it out, but those of you who are of my generation may remember this from the golden age of cinema, calendar year 2001. But so much to talk about here. Obviously, time flies when you are having fun. So I'm going to try and hit the broad strokes, and then maybe, if people have questions, we can go into some more of the details. So Sohrab Shahid Saleh was somebody that I sort of saw mentioned a lot in the literature on New German cinema for quite a long time, and it ended up being the case that nobody had actually gone further than a footnote or a chapter in a book at most. And so I figured I would take a swing at it. And I found that he's only really reduced when he is mentioned at all to his status sort of as exilic, as an exile, right? To the sort of, he's reduced to the interstices of Iran, his homeland, and Germany, where the majority of his filmography was produced, and it is his films are interpreted according to autobiographical details primarily. And I don't hold that against anybody, right? But anybody with familiarity with both cultural traditions is going to be a little bit annoyed by that, because in this case, I did look into it, and I think it's sort of a lazy way to go about it. So especially if, like Professor Sabina Hake outlined in her talk, we're sort of defining the national in a relevant way as a sort of collective imaginary, not in terms of some normative ideological function. I actually think that the most productive reading of two of, in my example, Shahid Saleh's first films in Exile, Reifezeit, coming of age is the sort of idiomatic translation of that, and Tagebuch eines Liebenden, Diary of a Lover, derives not from his national and cultural background, but from his consistent political engagement and his affinity for social critique. And in conversation then with sort of I think other theory that I think is relevant, what emerges is actually films that as a sort of a diptych work to portray a main character who is symptomatic of the trauma that is at the intersection of gendered socialization and capitalist labor divisions in West Germany and beyond. And so, if actually in the context of his life, his engagement reflects an outsider's perspective, it's really not in terms of an engagement with the status of other or something sort of like, with racial implications like that, that were conferred on him inevitably by his displacement, but actually through a very sort of sophisticated and substantively Marxist, I feel, analysis that comes out in his films. And they're not hard, they're actually quite hard to find, the films. We don't have any copies in the UC libraries here. And the films have never been, with a possible exception of a couple, released at all, right? I think what is available now that I'm going to show you is pan and scan from converted from VHS onto YouTube. And he's generally when he is presented then in sort of like these retrospectives, right? And there always this framing, like he was part of for the Deutsches Historisches Museum, an example of a Weltbürger of cinema who nevertheless sort of reflected on Germany's status as an immigrant nation. What actually ends up being the case when you look into it is that nobody really actually in West Germany was able to help Sohrab, Shahid, Sales. He struggled to fund his work in West Germany, and as he himself claims in an interview, there he is, actually close to where I am now. He never received a penny from the government of the Federal Republic, which during his period of activity provided substantial financial support for other West German filmmakers, including some of his friends. It was those people, right, that ended up making the films that we think of as New German cinema, kind of Fassbinder, Herzog, Wenders, and the historian Lothar Eisner actually recounts that Herzog, who was a friend of Shahid Saleh's, quote, viewed Sales as a German filmmaker because he works here, bei uns arbeitet, is his words, or hers, quoting him. And if he should have difficulties, we would all be obligated to help him, end quote. And the prepositional phrase bei uns in German obviously sort of connotes a guest host relationship. And that is a sort of indicative of a reality contrary to the wish that maybe Herzog would have expressed, right? That working in West Germany actually didn't make Shahid Sales a German filmmaker, not in the eyes of the West German film industry, and indeed not in the literature. When you look back on this period, is he really canonized? He himself, of course, refused to be categorized according to the label of the Iranian diaspora cinema. And in the context that, for example, here in Berkeley, there has been a tribute to him in this BAMFA, the Berkeley, I always forget what it stands for, the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. They're framing it in terms of his early sort of Iranian work as part of a collective of independent filmmakers that would later go on to be very influential in Iran. But again, that sort of, frustrates me, right? It doesn't quite get at the core of his work. Shahid Sales, of course, was actually exiled professionally, even if he nominally left on good terms, because at the end, the sort of the government of the Shah declared that based on his filmmaking, he was a Soviet agent, and made it impossible for him to produce films. And that, in effect, was exile, even though both governments, as the sort of currently the I would say the dominant scholar in the field on his work, Hamid Nafisi has pointed out. He was welcomed back under both regimes, but of course, he knew better in a certain sense than to take them up on it. And what ends up coming across in his films, as I want to point out, is that what is important here with Shahid Salehi is that, in fact, he was if not a Soviet agent, he was at least deserving of the suspicion of the Shah that he was creating leftist films. And there are actually shared authorial signatures between Shahid Salehi's first two movies in Iran and his subsequent releases in West Germany, like the sort of repetition of the mundane that can't be really reduced to autobiographical details. And they show the kernel of truth, actually, I would say, in his censorship, effectively. And I'm going to argue, we're going to skip a little bit of the theory that I'm rejecting, because I think that that's probably more inside baseball. The way that the mundane and the minutia of the everyday is actually presented in Shahid Salehi is through repetition, through the subtle recurring sort of activities that sort of present the mundanity of the everyday, not as sort of, uncanny curios or, hey, look what happens, how wonderful life is, but as sort of moments in a structural totality. And the films that I'm about to discuss contain a remarkably coherent theoretical indictment, I feel, of capitalism and patriarchy. And the first film in the cycle begins with the coming of age, as the title suggests, of Mikhail Bauer, who is an 8-year-old boy who comes to realize that the stigma surrounding his mother's occupation as a sex worker and her place in society is affecting him. And in the end, he comes to learn details about it. She's not named the mother in the credits, but we might venture to call her Ms. Bauer. And she's not really afforded the sort of the solidarity that sex workers in some of Shahid Salehi's other films actually achieve. We see her almost exclusively from the limited sort of perspective of a child, of a male child at that. It's a narrative point of view that's all the more restricted due to the nature of a sort of interior monologue and the broader sort of context of social life around him. He goes to school, he stares quietly at the dinner table, and he sees another boy riding a bicycle in a circle. He develops like a fixation on this, like he's bored to death, this kid. And he wants to purchase his own, so he regularly buys groceries for Frau Bayer, not to be confused with Frau Bauer, the elderly blind woman who lives in his apartment building, and he gets 50 cents, a modest commission. And sometimes he also steals money from his classmates, including some chocolate from a female classmate called Monica, and that's going to be important in a second. And eventually, things sort of fall apart. His mom visits his grandfather, who berates her and is just, you immediately get a sense of why this woman doesn't have a relationship with this guy. And in the final scene, he returns home from school to find his mom performing oral sex on a client, and that causes him to sort of leave quietly and wait at the bottom of the stairs for the stranger to leave. And what comes out is the repetition of sort of dissociations and humiliations, of sort of fears and sort of unspoken pressures that are absorbed. And it shows in a way, the film, how his mother's social and economic sort of context has imprinted itself on Michael. I kind of want to focus in the limited time that we have on, just so you get a sense of what both movies look like and sound like, the beginning of each film. This is how Reifezeit begins. And I I want to emphasize especially how time as a way that the workday, in fact, our entire lives under capitalism is structured, is a determining, in fact, the sort of structuring element of the film, certainly the sonic soundscape, which features basically no other sound but the sound of ticking clocks and alarms. I hope everyone can hear the audio okay. So there is, you know, obviously there's sort of these, in the next film, you'll see also these identically written, sort of handwritten title cards. And we start out in each case with an exterior shot of a drab sort of apartment building and the uneasy sound of ticking clocks. And as we cut to, in a second, Michael's mother preparing for work in coming of age, we're gonna see Michael sleeping. There's not a lot of dialogue, so I'm just gonna kind of let this play out. We get this sort of rare moment with her at the very beginning alone, and there's sort of a foreboding inevitability even to this rare sort of musical flourish that finally wakes his mother. And visually, sort of doorways, windows, the right angles of the apartment interiors, and just enclose people within space in this film. There's a film by Shahid Saleh called Still Life. It could be the title of all of his films because there is such a static, this is quite mobile for Shahid Saleh. There's quite a static fixation on inanimate objects. And isolated people and objects are ultimately what become for him locked in these patterns set to the schedule of the capitalist workday in patterns of active dysfunction. And in the second film, oops, that is a little bit of theory we might not get to, but maybe we will. In the second film, sorry, that was the second film. In the first film, we get a similar situation. Obviously, the stylistic kind of conventions and their social implications are not only operative in, but come to sort of an unsettling climax then in the second film. And in the second film, you get the idea, sorry. Why did it go out of full screen? And in the second film, we learned that Michael has become a butcher. He used to get Frau Bayer's bratwurst for a modest commission, and he works now as a butcher in a grocery store. He waits for his girlfriend Monica to return home, and he complains of headaches. He shows up late for work and then blames it on a stomach ache. We clearly have an unreliable narrator, almost more so than when the narrator was a child. He witnesses his coworker being abused by a customer. He doesn't, come to her defense or help her. And later he asks her out on a date. He's just like, he is a cad. And he basically all but ignores his mother when she visits him, timid, concerned, inquisitive. And at the end of the film, we find out that he, having waited the entire film for his girlfriend Monica to return home, remember the name of the girl he stole chocolate from, later we find out at the very end of the film that the police have found Monica's strangled corpse under his bed. And whether this is the same character obviously is not made totally explicit. Shahid Saleh in an interview basically says that he wants you to think of them this way. And I think that there is a lot in terms of the theory then that we can actually get out of these films that have nothing to do with his sort of emigre experience, Shahid Saleh's. And I think that in part, what is important here, we're going to get to the theory in a second, but if you are familiar with these texts, you may recognize where I'm going with this in the closing argument, that the insistence that the boy in the first film is the man in the second sort of opens up this vast sphere of political critique. And it's organized around the intersection of capitalism and patriarchy. And actually, if any sort of axis of identification could be seen as a determining factor here, it was probably Shahid Saleh's experience of masculine gender identity, right? Like if we're doing ideology critique, we got to keep it real here. There's probably some in these films problematic instrumentalization of these images that I'm describing, that I won't show you, obviously, of women's subjugation in a very sort of structuralist second wave, as the kids say, understanding of sex work, and this sort of representational strategy does reduce women to the sort of the realm of unconscious and the object, which of course for Freud was one thing, das es, the it. And it's just sort of as a matter of fact that both films adopt the point of view of Michael in order to depict the development of his social identity, especially his gender identity. And, you know, that fact is really sort of emphasized in the reality that actually the only character that he really has an observable engagement with in either film, the only characters rather are women. They are clearly the sort of the foil for Mikhail's broken subjectivity. And what ends up coming out as the final kind of structural analysis is a sort of a Fordism of the home, a manufacturing of the domestic violence as a sort of a structural byproduct of the way that men are socialized, right? And in the end, I think that the film is concerned less with moralizing against sex work than with highlighting in a sort of a Marxist vein, this sort of social and economic power relations that undergird the self-alienating, in a way, trauma that the Shahid Saleh's characters endure. So this conception of trauma is consistent, I think, in a way with Marx's formulation that prostitution is just a specific expression of the general prostitution of the worker. And because prostitution is a relationship that encompasses not only the prostitute, but also he who prostitutes, i.e. der Prostituierende, the pimp, as we might say, whose baseness is even greater, thus the capitalist, etc., also falls into this category. That's obviously sort of an uncomfortable implication there that Marx is saying that there's something base about sex work. Never let it be said that he was sex positive, but Shahid Saleh, I think, opens himself up to a similar critique, but also is sort of best read in this way as a leftist filmmaker of the 1970s whose systemic critique of sort of all life under capitalist division of labor really does kind of register the foundational role of gender depression in that division of labor. To conclude, I think that this reading of the film sort of tracks with the Marxist feminist theory of the day, the psychoanalytically informed theory, for example, of the sociologist Nancy Chodorow. And I think that if you look at the structure of the films, you sort of see how a defective version, perhaps, but nonetheless based on a certain model of domination of masculinity, is really the subject of alienation in these films. Just to read out the quote, perhaps that is just dated enough that it might provoke some of you, and we can talk about it in the comments. An increasingly father-absent, mother-involved family produces in men a personality that both corresponds to masculinity and male dominance as these are currently constituted in the sex-gender system, and fits appropriately with participation in capitalist relations of production. Men continue to enforce the sexual division of spheres as a defense against powerlessness in the labor market. Male denial of dependence and of attachment to women helps to guarantee both masculinity and performance in the world of work. The relative unavailability of the father.
Kumars,
yes.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up with one final thought.
Absolutely. And so the overability of the mother then create negative definitions of masculinity, etc. And in obviously Michael is not efficient or reliable or particularly masculine, but in a way I think that these are films about how the daily traumas and humiliations, they seem individual, momentary, are also structural and recurring. They're endemic not just to Iran, Germany, whatever, but they're in everywhere where the social fabric is held together by these oppressive social systems.
Okay, thank you very much for your thought-provoking review of Shahid Saleh's work. Next, we will hear from Valerie Weinstein. Valerie is Associate Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Niehoff Professor in Film and Media Studies, and Affiliate Faculty in German Studies and Judaic Studies at the University of Cincinnati. She is the author of Anti-Semitism in Film Comedy in Nazi Germany, out with Indiana University Press in 2019, and numerous articles on Weimar and Nazi cinema. She is co-editor with Barbara Hales and Michaela Petrescu of the 2016 work Continuity and Crisis in German Cinema, 1928 to 1936, and with Barbara Hales of Rethinking Jewishness in Weimar Cinema from this year. This presentation is part of her current book project on the reactionary transnational. All you, Valerie. And Valerie, you are muted.
Sorry about that. I did the screen share first and then I couldn't figure out how to unmute. Anyway, thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you to the conference organizers, your home institutions, the funding agencies, and all of you here making this a really wonderful conference. I'll begin by highlighting that I changed my title. This project, well, the whole book project that it's a part of is kind of on hold with the pandemic because it required a whole lot of archival research that I have been unable to do. So I was able to do less in this paper and have to do more speculative theoretical work than I intend to end with once I can actually get into the archives and figure what's going on. Anyway, I think you'll still find this interesting. In 1927, Friedrich Dalsheim, a 32-year-old attorney from Frankfurt am Main, learned to use a movie camera and traveled with Gulub Pfeffer to Cameroon, Nigeria, and Togo, where they made the ethnographic film Menschen im Busch. In 1930, Dalsheim accompanied Baron Victor von Plessen on an expedition to Bali. There he made Insel der Dämonen, an ethnographic film with a fictionalized narrative, which premiered in Berlin on February 16, 1933, just 2 weeks after Hitler became chancellor. That summer, Dalsheim traveled to Southeast Greenland with Knud Rasmussen to make The Wedding of Paulo, a fictionalized representation of Inuit life. After Paulo, Dalsheim returned to Indonesia with von Plessen to make Die Kopfjäger von Borneo, a German-Dutch co-production that premiered in Berlin on August 4th, 1936, without crediting Dalsheim's involvement. Dalsheim was Jewish and therefore not permitted to work in the German film industry. He shot himself 2 weeks later on August 19th, 1936, in the hotel room in Zurich where he had been living. The police reported that Dalsheim's suicide was motivated by financial difficulties. The personal and professional pressures of exile and statelessness were no doubt contributing factors. Dalsheim's Third Reich era films were made in Danish and Dutch colonies. Dalsheim found this work because of his film's strong reputation, his existing professional connections, and cultural and linguistic ties between Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands and their respective film industries. Rasmussen, for example, sought out collaborations with German filmmakers because of his affinity with German ethnographers, Berlin's strong market for ethnographic films, and Hollywood's lack of interest in his projects. Scholarship on German exile cinema focuses primarily on feature films made in Hollywood, and to a lesser extent, European studios. Dalsheim decenters this conversation because his involvement in Northern European ethnographic and colonial filmmaking positioned him differently, spatially, artistically, and ideologically from the best-known exile filmmakers. Exile, ethnography, and colonialism intersect in Dalsheim's work in interesting ways. Even as he experienced the impact of racial anti-Semitism and dislocation of exile, Dalsheim participated in colonial projects that racialized and displaced others. Dalsheim's films thus trouble major binaries often used to categorize German films from the early 1930s: fiction versus documentary, fascist versus exile, and Jewish versus German filmmakers. My case study suggests that continuing scholarship on Dalsheim's films can complicate and decenter our understanding of German cinema in the early 1930s. In the summer of 1933, Dalsheim traveled with Knud Rasmussen to the isolated southeast coast of Greenland to make The Wedding of Paulo, a fictionalized representation of early 20th century East Greenlandic Inuit life. Rasmussen, the son of a Danish missionary and a Norwegian Inuit mother, was born and raised in a Danish colony in Western Greenland. He spoke both Western Greenlandic and Inuit language and Danish natively. He was a renowned explorer, ethnographer, and Danish national hero. Although educated in the Danish tradition, as a child, Rasmussen also learned indigenous Greenlandic skills, like dog sledding, hunting, and survival in Arctic conditions. As an adult, he traveled the Arctic, including a record-breaking dog sled expedition across the Northwest Passage, conducting ethnographic research of Inuit peoples. Rasmussen's loyalty to Denmark, his research, and his founding of the Thule colony, which now houses a US air base, made him a key agent in the colonization of Northern Greenland. He was famous in his lifetime and remains respected in Inuit communities for his documentation of Inuit languages and cultures in the early 20th century. Rasmussen planned 3 films documenting the development of Inuit culture from European contact to the present to generate more funding for his expeditions. Paulo was the first. The rest were never made, however, because Rasmussen died prematurely in December 1933, when Paulo was in post-production. Paulo thus became a monument to Rasmussen's career, including an added prologue of him making the film. The Danish Prime Minister Thorvald Stauning gave a speech at Paulo's premiere. The previous year, Rasmussen had testified at the International Court of Justice at The Hague in favor of Denmark's successful suit for sovereignty over East Greenland. Understood in that context, the rhetoric and symbolism of Paulo's premiere and the film's prologue showing Danish mastery over Arctic conditions amount to what Ebbe Folkerdsen calls a symbolic act of land appropriation, asserting Danish dominance over the land and people of Eastern Greenland. Reading Paulo as a Dalsheim film goes against the grain of that film's marketing and reception, in which Dalsheim barely figures. On the one hand, this is typical of Dalsheim's films, where the explorer usually got top billing. On the other hand, this effect was exaggerated in the case of Paulo because of Rasmussen's fame and untimely death. Dalsheim's eclipse by Rasmussen and other explorers is one of several contributing factors to his erasure from both film history and colonial histories, factors that also include the Nazi takeover of the German film industry and the corresponding break in German film historiography, Dalsheim's exile, and his suicide in 1936. Not only does Dalsheim merit study as a marginalized and forgotten filmmaker, but also the questions of whiteness, colonialism, and ethnography raised by his films complicate ongoing discussions about the racialization and positionality of Jewish Germans in the 1930s. The Wedding of Paulo is about the rivalry between 2 men, Paulo and Sano, for the affections of Navarana, who prefers Paulo. The conflict is first evident when both men bring Navarana courtship gifts. Paulo makes jewelry, Sano hunts seal and polar bear and brings Navarana their pelts. Then Sano attacks Paulo while the community is salmon fishing. To resolve the problem peaceably, Navarana's brother proposes a traditional drum dance in which rivals defeat one another through clever mockery. Sano breaks the rules and stabs Paulo. Meanwhile, Navarana's family moves to their winter camp. After a shaman heals Paulo, he paddles his kayak through a hurricane to retrieve his beloved. Navarana goes with him eagerly. Sano chases the couple and threatens them with a spear, but his kayak overturns in the rough water. Paulo and Navarana escape and begin their life together. Paulo is a hybrid of documentary and feature filmmaking, like Robert Flaherty's 1922 Nanak of the North, which Fatima Tobing-Roni calls romantic ethnography with a taxidermic function. Like Nanak, Paulo is an art film that freezes indigenous people in time and, quote, hinges upon a nostalgic reconstruction of a more authentic humanity, end quote. Set among and performed entirely by Inuit people, Paulo purported to represent authentic Inuit characters and traditions for audiences steeped in European and American film conventions. A scripted love rivalry frames a display of Inuit customs that had still been practiced around 1910, but that were not widespread in 1933. Lay actors reenacted their parents' and grandparents' traditions, like the drum dance, shamanic healing, hunting and fishing methods, creating an aura of authenticity. Anthropologist Thomas Kiefer lauds Paulo for isolated sequences that capture traditions of the Angmasalik Inuit and criticizes it as exemplary of, quote, the problems of imposing our narrative structure on Eskimo culture, end quote. Werner Speerschneider diagrams how Paulo's narrative structure and editing are consistent with Aristotelian drama and the Western tradition. By writing a script that framed Paulo's ethnographic reconstruction within a Western narrative structure, Rasmussen intentionally appealed to Euro-American audiences. This results from the double bind described by Wolfgang Fuhrmann, which trapped ethnographic filmmakers between their research agendas and the financial pressures of commercial filmmaking. US and European audiences and critics in the 1930s received Paulo warmly. It was nominated in 1934 for the Mussolini Cup for Best Foreign Film at the Venice Film Festival, and named a top foreign film by the US National Board of Review in 1937. Cinematically, Paulo conforms to German paradigms. There are strong aesthetic similarities between Paulo, Arnold Funk's mountain films, and Leni Riefenstahl's work, which have been criticized for their right-wing political leanings. In the case of Paulo, these stylistic similarities have direct causes. Most obviously, Paulo's cameramen, Walter Traut and Hans Scheib, collaborated with all three directors on multiple occasions. And Dalsheim worked with other artists in Funk's and Riefenstahl's circle on his other productions. Ofer Ashkenazi's article on Walter Frenz's Hinter am Werk and Helma Lerski's Avoda demonstrates that this style of Weimar modernism influenced both Third Reich and Exile films with very different political agendas. Aesthetically and politically, Paulo differs from Funk's and Riefenstahl's oeuvre in subtle but significant ways. How they highlight the German characters and filmmakers' ability to master cold and hostile nature is central to readings of Bergfilme as nationalist spectacles. Using similar stylistic techniques, Paulo shifts away from white conquerors toward indigenous people at home in the Arctic, constructing an other for the presumed white European spectator, rather than an ideal image of the self. Shared techniques include the composition, framing, cinematography, and montage of landscape shots, and editing between close-ups and crowd scenes that highlight individual physiognomy as representative of the. In Palo, these techniques create a racing ethnographic gaze that emphasizes bonds between Inuit bodies, culture, and the Arctic environment, a conceptual constellation rooted in 19th century German thought. They construe Inuit people as authentic ethnographic objects, which European explorers record, preserve, and integrate into colonial systems of knowledge and power, like the imperial eyes of 19th century travel writers that Mary Louise Pratt theorizes. As in 19th century travel writing, despite the power imbalance and the racialized colonial framing, the centering of indigenous people in Palo has ambivalent effects. Instead of depicting Inuit people as entirely alien, Palo attempts to balance similarities and differences between the Inuit and Palo's intended audiences, and uses the love narrative to emphasize the similarities. Eric Gant argues that by centering the strong emotions of Inuit characters, Palo refuted Flaherty's claim that Inuit people did not express their emotions in a way that could be shown on film. The many facial close-ups in Palo not only emphasize physiognomic difference and use conceptual editing to link that difference to both culture and environment, but also highlight strong and familiar human emotions, inviting empathy with the protagonists. The net historical impact of Palo, according to various sources, was to familiarize the Inuit for Euro-American audiences of the 1930s, transforming them from inscrutable alien others to people that these audiences could understand as being somewhat like themselves, albeit with traditions suited to the demanding Arctic landscape and climate. At the same time, the depiction of Inuit as passionate people with violent potential played into Danish nationalist colonial narratives of imposing law and order on Greenlanders. Palo simultaneously promotes Danish colonialism in Greenland, represents Inuit as exotic racial others frozen in time, and attributes affect, agency, and voice to them. The result is ambivalent. For example, Palo's attempts to give the Inuit their own voice in the new medium of sound film. Greenlandic is the only language spoken in Palo, with intertitles translating dialogue for the viewer. Yet, because the filmmakers could not capture high-quality sound on location, Palo's dialogue was dubbed over in Copenhagen by Greenlanders from various other regions. According to Sperrschneider, the voice actors' variety of dialects and pronunciations leads to comic alienating effects for native Greenlandic speakers. Rasmussen named the colony he founded in northern Greenland Thule, the classical name for the unknown north. In the 1930s, Nazi mystics sought another Thule, a mythical home of their fantasized Aryan ancestors. Even as Nazis and other Europeans sought their whiteness in mastery of the Arctic North, Palo shows that Arctic space is not the virgin territory of colonial fantasies, as theorized by Susanna Zantop. Greenland is already occupied by people with names, faces, and emotions who have traditional ways of surviving and thriving in that land. Palo can be interpreted as an example of what Homi Bhabha calls colonial mimicry, an ambivalent discourse in which the other partially speaks back, troubling but not undermining colonial hegemony. Interpreting Palo as an example of colonial mimicry would explain the film's ambivalence, its hybrid mixture of Western narrative and Inuit self-representation, and its representation of Inuit people as, in Bhabha's words, almost the same, but not quite. Such a reading flows easily from the standard framing of Palo as a Rasmussen film. Rasmussen's mixed race background, hybrid education, contributions to Western scholarship, and support for Denmark's colonization of Greenland fit Bhabha's definition of a mimic man, a colonial subject who creates himself in the image of the colonizer. But what happens if we shift our perspective from Rasmussen to Dalsheim as Paulo's auteur. As director, and because he outlived Rasmussen, Dalsheim certainly influenced the final product. How can we relate Dalsheim's complex positionality as a German Jewish exile to Paulo's ethnographic gaze and colonial ambivalence? Christian Davis argues that in Germany's imperial era, colonialism fostered a new identity, the white colonizer, through which Jews could find acceptance and inclusion alongside German Gentiles. Yet, Nazi racializations of Jews troubled such identifications, construing Jews as racially other, in various discourses as hybridized, Asiatic, Semitic, or Black. And Jewish Germans' whiteness, however tenuous in the first place, was challenged. Ethnographic filmmaking might have sustained Dalsheim's identifications with white colonizers at a time when his Germanness and whiteness were in question. But I also wonder, to what extent would it be useful to conceptualize Dalsheim as a different kind of mimic man, as a stateless and vulnerable German Jewish exile whose position in the German film industry was eroding rapidly, even as he continued to work. Dalsheim might have experienced his own positionality vis-a-vis non-Jewish filmmakers as another variation on almost the same, but not quite. If so, how might I begin to locate and talk about Dalsheim's not quite whiteness behind the camera in Paulo? And I leave it at that question, and maybe some of you have suggestions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Valerie. Big thank you to all of our presenters. And we have about half an hour for conversation right now, for a discussion. And I will go ahead and field questions. I encourage participants to, again, use the Q&A function to either type your comments and questions into the respective box. So the first question is from Ekaterina Pirozhenko. It's for André. She says, I enjoyed your reading of the film as the one about diverse time spaces, contemplation of faith, and Chihuahua as colonial territory. In her keynote, Sabina Hake commented on the possibilities that documentary films can offer for the emergence of new history narratives. Obviously, Reygadas' film is not a documentary, but the director filmed the real-life Mennonites' lands, the Mennonites' businesses, and the real-life Mennonites, in parentheses, both trained actors and non-trained actors. Moreover, the parents and children of the lead character, Johann, played by Cornelius Wall, are actually Wall's children and parents. Some Mennonites express pride and satisfaction with this film precisely because it was shot for the most part in Plautic, and they were thinking about future generations who would be able to witness the way the Mennonites spoke and still speak the language. What are your thoughts about this film as a kind of archive?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I think it's particularly interesting because, and I haven't done enough research about that question, but from what I've read, there is also aniconism is very important in Mennonite culture. So taking pictures of them is controversial, and Reygadas had to convince them through working with them, actually being able to film them in the first place. Then on top of that, he shows them in a way that most of these conservative Mennonites probably would not want to be portrayed. For example, committing adultery. There's a very extensive sex scene between Johann and Marianne, which is very beautiful, but goes against how a married man should be portrayed. So this is probably not how Mennonites would like to be archived in that sense. At the same time, there is that sort of pride. I mean, casting was assisted by a German club called the Plautic Freunde Detmold. They sort of found, for example, Marianne, who lives in Germany but comes from Ukraine. So there was an engagement of the Mennonite community in making this film happen, but it was very controversial. And I think also Cornelio Ball, who played the Johann, had problems after that, sort of in terms of how he is regarded in his community after producing such a film. that sheds a certain light on Mennonites in a way they would not want to be seen, probably some of them. Yeah, so that's something that I sort of, it's a tricky question to sort of, it has a documentary value because you see them as you probably have never seen them before. But in a way that's not agreeable to them in a lot of ways.
Thank you. Yeah, and also it pushes the question of rather whose responsibility is it to provide this authentic presentation, representation of a migrant community. You know, it pushes, from what I hear you saying, it pushes the boundaries, the film pushes the boundaries between, you know, fiction and documentary. And again, precisely because it offers at the same time this pride that the Mennonites feel and that is depicted, but then it also shows them as in conflict with their moral laws and the very dogma that they bring with them to this community in Chihuahua.
So it's sort of like Rossellini's Germany Zero is it's neorealism. You cast non-professional actors, and sort of no one would claim that this is sort of a documentation of actual Germans, even though what you see on the screen are sort of non-professional actors in Germany 45. It's, in that sense, a typical neorealist device.
So thank you. The next question is for everybody, actually. It comes from Randall Halle. He says, this question is less the content, although I learned a great deal from each paper. I wonder if the participants on the panel could offer some meta reflections on their methodology and that of their fellow panelists. I just want to say how impressed I am by the papers presented here. Contrary to Sabina's assessment of a philological bias in German cinema studies, these papers attest to an approach to German film production that attends to complex connectivity, follows funding and reception strategies, looks at below-the-line labor, and considers the content. Given the overall theme of the gathering, in what way do you see your work at odds with or at the heart of German film studies? It's a big question. So maybe Biz or Valerie or Kumars can.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me, we have a sort of an idiosyncratic, or so I thought, department out here that is very sort of focused on transnational and sort of critical, the buzzword I guess these days is critical race theory, but we sort of, you know, have been more on the front line in integrating those kind of more interdisciplinary, sometimes explicitly anti-racist perspectives into our scholarship. And I feel that it's just a current that has been bubbling up as people from different backgrounds get involved in the field of German studies. You're going to have those different perspectives. And, you know, who knows, like I'm somebody who's, you know, future in the university job market is like very uncertain, right? But in a way, I'm optimistic because I feel like now compared to when I started my PhD, there's a lot more, at least appreciation for, maybe this year alone has seen more of a jump in what the assessment in the mainstream of academia is of the need for this, in attention paid to the issues that are tend to be sidelined when there's a concern, which is still predominant in many more conservative institutions, with the sort of reproducing the canon and making sure that the specificity of German cultural history in that traditional way is preserved. So, you know, it's a challenge, you know, but I think that actually it's going to be antagonistic, maybe, I guess, if people are territorial, but I don't see why it has to be. I think that there's actually a lot of this kind of focus in the field already.
Okay. Valerie and Biz, what do you think?
Well, when it comes to my project, I don't see it as grounded in German film studies at all, really, because it's part of a larger umbrella project that's looking at the role of new media in representations of migrant experience. So it's intersecting with film studies in this particular moment in a really interesting way. And that's where I see a lot of the work that I find really interesting these days, the like sort of transdisciplinary approach, bringing different media texts in dialogue with other media tech, so speaking across media. So I'm looking at film and at cell phones and Facebook and WhatsApp and all of these other new media and social media platforms. So that's my particular methodology, and it's really interesting to present it in this particular context, which feels much more grounded in German film studies, and so that I can learn from that as well.
Mm-hmm. Valerie, how about you?
Yeah, so thanks, Randall, for the great question. I was excited by Sabina's talk because I was like, oh my God, she's telling me to do what I think my project's doing. So this project, which like has been put on hold by the pandemic, which was unfortunate because I was on sabbatical and couldn't do my research, but someday. What I'm trying to do in this particular project actually is trace the transnational networks, so production, reception, these you called them below the line labor, like the cinematographers and stuff who were working in the circle around Arnold Funk and Leni Riefenstahl, right? Because these are sort of German film studies bad objects, and they are, you know, are fascists, and it's all about German nationalism. But from the beginning, those films were totally transnational productions, right? They were taking place in the Alps where the borders were uncertain. The personnel on them are from multiple places. The funding is multiple. They're really well received in places like Japan. So to sort of problematize the ways in which the national and its fascism are sort of bracketed off from, oh, but then there are the transnational movies that show, you know, the people of color and the migrants and the da-da-da-da. And in fact, these things were never, as she was saying in her talks, I was excited because this is what I'm trying to show, it's always interconnected. And I started this project, you know, in tandem with, frankly, the rise of populist politics in the United States and Europe, and the ways in which they are networked through the media. And I think as Germanists, German film scholars, our focus on like, oh yeah, the fascists were only inward looking, and the left wing, you know, believes in the international and the solidarity, like that was never true. The historical fascists also had global networks that are transnational. And so I'm trying to trace the global connections of fascist media in these different ways. And the piece I'm working on right now with Dalsheim, right, is totally fascinating to me because, like, God, we're not supposed to be saying that the Jewish exiles, you know, are like wrapped up in these horrible projects, but at the same time, yeah, it was just much more complicated than we wish it was. And it's not just this bad object to throw out, it's this networked object that's connected to everything. So
yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It seems that, you know, our work being at odds with German studies actually puts us at the heart of German studies at this place in time. I mean, fascism translates across word and image, and so we are uncoupling this sort of centralized notion of what it means within this context. So yeah, André, what do you think? Are you at odds, or are you at the center of German studies?
I just had to think about the sort of transnational fascist aesthetic with regard to 1930s and Louis Trenker and these films when he goes to the US and so on. So there is a lot of there's a long tradition there also of popular films in that regard. So one connection, because the question was also about sort of shared methodologies, and I think is departing in a way from the self-reflexivity of the medium itself. So what the films give us in terms of the connections they make, that to follow up on them. So what I've tried to do is sort of to unpack an aspect that Reygadas builds on, but it's never spelled out. It's never discussed that these are Mennonites and what they believe in, how they got there, and whom they displaced there, and so on. But it's nevertheless a content of the film that we even consider talking about it in terms of documentary. What I thought about with regards to Biz paper, there was also the question of self-reflexivity and with the use of sort of cell phones, and always there's this new technology that needs to sort of tell us, look, I'm here, this new technology, and sort of builds on the authenticity of of the migrant voyage and documenting that, and then reflects on that by omitting that crucial part. Yeah, I also had to think of Jafar Panahi's "This is not a film." Yeah, sort of the playing with what the device can do and how the immediacy that is suggested, and then how it suggests what is outside of the frame. And in Panahi's case, that would be sort of censored. So I think these questions naturally take us sort of across disciplinary boundaries if you follow these traces in the films, and it's something that I've tried to do, and I think Biz also was in her paper present. So that kind of self-reflexivity, that's something that I would see as a methodological connection there.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the authenticity, and Biz here, I will also focus in on something that or many things that you mentioned in your presentation, but the notion that this family who used 3 cell phones to document their entire journey, that is the only document that they had at that point. That is the only validation of their existence as they are moving. And nowadays, I mean, I've argued that migrants are either shown as, poor and helpless, dying on the one hand, or as a threat. And so it was not surprising to me when you mentioned that, all of a sudden the cell phone now providing this, again, this new authenticity, this reorientation of what it means to be a migrant and asylum seeker, actually a 3-dimensional person who's very complex and who is coming up against thousands of years of basic human behavior that is crossing from, moving from one place to another. And now it said, oh, no, actually, cell phones, we have to attach that to terrorists because that is what they're using. So I found that striking. Did you want to respond, or I don't want to?
Yeah, with regards to that, for both of your comments, yeah, the self-reflexivity is something that I find very fascinating, but also the agency that's embodied in this kind of self-reflexivity, like the way in which these narratives are being documented or written and shared from the migrants themselves, as opposed to like the inversion of subject and object that comes alongside the emergence of these kinds of technologies. So all of those things are kind of tied up together for me. Thinking about mediation, but also thinking about the agency in the narrativizing of these particular experiences.
Absolutely. And then who supports that narrativization too, who allows it to actually come to light.
Yeah, part of this project looks at migrant selfies and how they're emerging in news journalism. And so that this is facilitating more of a voice for individuals and displaced people, and how they're talking about their own experiences through the cell phone in particular, not just in terms of documentary film they're producing, but also in the news media.
Yes, absolutely. Edwin, I just saw a notification pop up that you would like to answer this question live.
God, I'm so sorry. I have no intention to, that must have been an accident.
Oh, okay, it's okay. It just popped up. I said, oh no, I just saw it.
I am attentively listening and very eager to hear the others respond. Sorry again.
No, it's okay. Anybody else would you like to add to this question in terms of methodology or? Go ahead.
I submit a question for André, right? I haven't seen this film, it's like decades after I stopped watching or something. But so your film, like mine, right, is sort of this fictional ethnography, as it were, except we don't think about it that way because they're white people, right? And these distinctions, say, that Tobin Roney will make between the ethnographiable and the historifiable peoples, and how we think about, right? Because all these questions about, oh, is it an archive, and oh, their unique language, it's exactly the same as the movie I presented on, right? It's this fictional love story about the Inuit and the first time we hear their language on film and all of these things. But we don't treat it as the same kind of objectification. And I don't have an answer. It was more a question because I thought, wow, we're kind of doing the same thing, but we talk about it very differently if it's white colonizers versus indigenous colonized in that story. So that was a connection I saw.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think Reygadas is generally interested in, because in his other films, his 2 previous films, there is an interest in native Mexican, rural, indigenous peoples to some extent. And I think also his latest film, which I haven't seen, goes somewhat in that direction. So I think one of his interests is to look at them as these others, as these white people who, yeah, seem like when you start watching the movie and you don't know anything about it, you don't know necessarily that there are Mennonites. They could be in Kansas. Nothing really gives you a clue. You have like 2 words of Spanish uttered in the entire film, so you really don't know where you are. And but I think he uses that not for the purpose necessarily of documentation, because it's very aestheticized. I mean, it's a film. You could say that, so I always thought films that people like Terrence Malick, sort of a film that he would have liked to make, but just not with Brad Pitt or Ben Affleck in the lead role, but sort of non-professional actors. And that's something that in that tension, that's where Reygadas really tries to generate these, effects of the wondrous and of the miraculous, that there is this very aestheticized perspective on people who have never been filmed, and are also not supposed to be filmed. So that's why I think sort of there is documentary value in there, but it's so aestheticized that it would be strange to take it at that face value, sort of, oh, this is how Mennonites live.
I think I'm going to push that notion a little bit in terms of it being almost whitewashed. You made the comment it could be anywhere in the Midwest. Why Chihuahua, Mexico then? I mean, the story, they came from Canada, from Manitoba, if I remember correctly, and they could have stayed in the United States, for example, but they skipped over, and out of all locations, we are in Chihuahua, Mexico, very close to the border. So I would like to push that a little bit in terms of, there must be a reason why that location was chosen. And the commentary that you just provided, it's very aestheticized, and, it's hard to recognize the panning shots and the landscapes. There is no geographical marker, and the linguistic markers are scarce as well, only a couple of words, if I remember correctly. So what kind of tension does that provide?
I mean, I think, well, Reygadas is a Mexican filmmaker, so he is interested in that otherness there. So I don't know, sort of I try to outline sort of what brought them there, which is sort of the most, from what I've understood, the most radical branch of the Mennonites, who would resist every effort of any kind of government to limit their ability to sort of be autarkic and self-determine their lifestyle. Sort of, it is that their migration movement is sort of generated by that conservatism, by that radical rejection of any sort of, well, it was Canadian prohibition of homeschooling, for example, that brought them there. Sort of, they were just looking for new land, and if the Mexican government would tell them to that their kids need to learn Spanish or something like that, then they might move again. So there are Mennonites in China and in Bolivia, and sort of like it seems they're serious about that sort of independence that they're trying to defend, and that's sort of what causes them to colonize. That's the reason for that.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have one more question. It's from Kalani Mitchell. Thank you all for these super helpful, varied talks. I didn't know anything about Dalsheim, but I'm fascinated now. My question is for Biz. Thank you for this enlightening overview of mobile phone technologies and their relationship with films depicting migration. You mentioned the functionality of these devices, for example, for WhatsApp messages, communication with journalists, activists, and family, etc. I'm wondering if you could comment on the position of noise in this communication structure, namely the breaking down of these communication structures, for example, the lack of internet connection. Is this featured in the film, and if so, how? And what relationship between this technology and the filmic technology is constructed here, if any?
This is something I also thought a lot about, because I'm thinking about smartphone, like social media platforms on smartphones in the larger project, but connectivity wasn't such a factor in this film. It was the device itself, whether or not it was connected to the internet was irrelevant. We watched a lot of scrolling. We watched the girls listening to YouTube videos, Michael Jackson, for example. And so there was connectivity that existed within the film itself, but it wasn't thematized in the same way as the smartphone device as a camera phone was. And those moments in which there was no filming going on, when there was no charge for the camera phone, for example, we did not have access to, and it wasn't really thematized. You do see a lot of scenes in which the family is walking through the woods or walking through fields. And so I had this big question about, like, how are they storing all of this data? And that wasn't addressed either in the film. So there were parts of the film's making that were really obfuscated. The editing wasn't done by the director. The music was produced after the fact. So all the post-production stuff wasn't really commented upon in the making of the film. Just the ideas of how the director himself saw this film being made, and the implications of other forms of media representation of forced migration came into play in those moments. But I had to wonder about more of the processes that we didn't have access to, and those moments that weren't filmed, and also not commented upon. That sequence in which the daughter is missing doesn't exist as footage for a very specific reason, as the director articulated, but we do have access to it in that monologue in which we're just sort of staring at the moon until the screen goes blank. There are other moments that I found really fascinating where mediation is thematized, but not necessarily smartphone mediation or camera phone. It was documenting televisions and watching footage that had been previously recorded by the director on a television. And so you have that, like, really like that static quality that you get when filming a TV becomes a characteristic of the documentary itself. So there's all of these layers of mediation that I found so fascinating that I've yet to unpack, because this is where I started this particular project, thinking about this way of theorizing the role of the smartphone. But there are a lot of relationships being constructed between the various media and what those media mean for, I think, in this particular context, but also in larger film histories, that I've yet to figure out. But thank you for that question. It's great.
Yes. And I'm actually going to hop on that and ask you, so how did it come to light? I mean, who provided the support and the financial backing? Because there are a number of families who have their cell phones, who are recording themselves taking images, and of course one has to be willing to actually share that, and the father is cited as the director. So who picked it up? Because it has become really accessible in mainstream media, so you can go on Amazon now and rent it, watch it, and in the background
also for free. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, it's public library in Vancouver. Yeah,
right. So why this one, and how do we make that jump to have this film and the connection to German studies, advertised beyond German studies, because that is all that we're fighting against also, the studies portion puts us everywhere, transdisciplinarily and interdisciplinarily. So how come this was such a success?
So I think this film in particular so the editor is an American, and I don't know how that relationship came about, which would be a really interesting avenue for further research. But the director was a documentary filmmaker in Afghanistan, and so he already had an established career. And I think this documentary film became part of his application for permanent residency in the various countries where he was applying to become a refugee. So I think it's like there's this entanglement with the politics of migration and the politics of its representation, and the role that this film probably played in establishing his permanent residency in Germany. So that's one way of answering that question. The other one that I think was really interesting about how it connects to German studies. And I do all this, and I'm very self-conscious about it when I do, where I'm like, and here's the moment that it connects to German studies, because they're in Germany now. Like, they landed in Hungary. This documentary stops at Hungary, but now they're in Germany, just like on the video game that I like to work on, Bury Me, My Love. It's a French-German video game. It's arguably just a French one. It's now international, but it's through the channel Art, which is French-German. So it's like these very loose connections that I feel like I have to validate when I'm doing this research as a Germanist, which I'm moving, like, it's difficult because I do so much work in media studies that expands upon that. But I think that the reason why I do this kind of work is because German studies offers us such a open area for scholarly investigation, such a transdisciplinary space where I feel free just to pursue the things that I find interesting, as long as I make that one statement. And now they're in Germany.
Absolutely. I mean, we're finding ourselves, and it's not just Germany, it's the European Union, the notion of the European Union. And as I think, André, you were pointing out earlier, after one of the first questions, I mean, we are being asked directly and indirectly to work within law, to work within geography, to work within migration studies, colonial studies, and German studies. So I think what we're being asked at this point, and what I think we should heed, is still that genuine anchoring, you know, in terms of this is the perspective, this is how it disseminates from German studies. However, our coordinates of reflection have to be just as authentic, genuine, and varied when it comes to the conversation that our works and that our reflections provide. So we have a couple more minutes. Did anybody else want to comment or ask, including the participants? Kumars, I actually wanted to ask you, in terms of availability and you know, sort of what one can see and how difficult is it to get at certain works. So is there a way to, for example, if I wanted to see Reifezeit or Tagebuch eines Liebenden, how can you comment on the accessibility today of these two works? Because you spent a good amount of time talking about how he was not just misrepresented, and this is only an autobiographical approach, etc.
Well, if you're a German speaker, then you're in luck as far as his German language filmography is concerned. In those two movies are, as I was, you know, I just embedded those videos from YouTube. They're on YouTube, so you can.
They're on YouTube. Okay.
Yeah, and that's just, I mean, if it's that itself, I mean, I made sure, but that in itself is usually evidence that an existing copyright is not being enforced because nobody cares that this movie is freely available, right? Like nobody has put it out and is losing money if everyone watches it for free. So the other stuff is just, you know, it's available like on the internet in like files that people have. A lot of this stuff was on TV, and so people sort of have just recordings of the TV VHSs, and it's put online. I would honestly say that due to the lack of scholarship and interest on the issue, your best bet is to wait for some art museum to have, or film place to have a retrospective on him. Or somehow there has to be a resurgence in interest.
I was about to say the question of ownership may be something that, you know, could be explored further.
Yeah, so, at this point, I mean, he's past. I don't know what his estate is you know, is doing. I guess that in that case, it would be up to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I would like to thank all attendees, participants, and our organizers for a wonderful first panel. I think it was very productive. I would like to remind everyone, so this is the only panel for today, and if I can figure out my desktop here it is. So tomorrow, Saturday, November 14th, we will begin at 11 a.m. Eastern time with our second panel titled Historical Perspectives. So once again, thank you everyone, and I hope you enjoy your weekend and stay healthy and safe.